Okay, welcome back to my channel, Made Between the Pages. My name is Taylor, and today we have a packed page-chewing episode. What we have affectionately dubbed our Big Brain Energy episode, because the collective brain power of all four of these guests is overwhelming in the best way possible. We have our two nemesis next to each other. Yes, Philip Chase and Critical Dragon, AP. So I wanted to give everyone a chance to kind of do a little bit of a self-introduction and let us know who you are and what you do in this book space. Of course, all of you do things outside of the book space, but maybe to start, just let us know what you do in that particular realm. Maybe if we start with Janny and then we kind of just go around, maybe Janny, John, AP, Philip. Does that work for you guys? Okay,
Sounds
great.
good.
All right, Janny, why don't you take it away?
I write novels and I scribble covers, and I apologize in the advance for any troublemaking.
No, you don't.
No, you don't. Yeah, I was gonna say no, you don't. And that's why we love you.
Completely insincere.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
What about you, John?
Hello. Yeah, my name is John. Thank you for having me on. I'm an assistant editor with Before We Go blog, together with Taylor and PL. And also I write for Grimdark Magazine.
I'm AP, and I'm basically professionally grumpy about storytelling.
I mean, I'm not disagreeing with that. I'm Philip Chase, and I run a YouTube channel creatively named Philip Chase, and I am an English professor, and I've written a few books. Nothing close to what Janny Wurts has written, not even like a fragment of what she's done. So I'm really honored to be here, and with my fellow authors, Janny Wurts and PL Stuart, whose series is also fantastic. I'm only one book in, but I'm going to be reading more soon. So this is truly an honor to be here with some of the best and the brightest. And I don't know why you invited me, but I'm glad to be here.
Oh, no. We are delighted to have all of you here. And I wanted to kind of start this off with a question for all of you. And you can take any part of the question that, speaks to you. But I find that I see you guys everywhere in the book space. I mean this in the best way. You're often on interviews. You're often, for John especially, pumping out reviews from Before We Go blog. I don't know how you do it. You're a wizard, okay? Especially Spiffo. Your speed, unmatched. But you're all very active in this space. But before coming to this space, you are already doing the thing that you're doing, right? So Janny, you've been, painting and writing for years and years. John, I had never heard about glass science before, but when I looked up, I was like, I'm learning new things. You are in a very prestigious place in a university. AP, you've done freelance editing for ages, and you have held a place of authority in that realm for a really long time. And Philip, you're also, a professor. So all of you have done what you're doing for so long. And I'm curious, when you started entering this kind of space, this online book world, how has that interacted with or changed or made you reflect on what you've already been doing? How has it changed your experience with your work? Anyone can take it.
Flat hasn't changed my experience with my work. My work was headlong, hardcore, stubborn all the way along the line. Where it's changed is that we can reach out to a wider community and talk about books and share what we love. And it's a fabulous community. It's really, really wonderful people. And they all bring their points of view to bear, and we can fight and we can agree and we can sympathize with each other. And it's an amazing world. But I think up till this point, a lot of what all of us were doing was very isolated.
Yeah, well said. For me, well, I had just written 2 textbooks, one that was about glass and one that was about kinetics, and I just felt completely drained by the time I got to the end of this one. I felt like I couldn't, write another sentence, and I think it's pretty easy to get lost in your own field, especially in an academic position, because there's so much pressure to do more research, more funding, more publications. But it's also really important to have a sense of balance. And for me, this was a way to get that balance. And it's actually reinvigorated my love of reading, my love of writing. I feel like I can just sit down now and the words come out so much more easily because of this experience. I've just also found, like, mentally, it's a lot better for me if I'm not, constantly thinking about only my formal field of study, but if I have a way to sort of switch modes, like using two different sides of my brain, and it makes for a much more fulfilling experience to be able to have those experiences, and most of all, to meet this wonderful community with all of you and so many others in the book community.
I think possibly the biggest impact it's had on my work is, I've now transitioned back to academia, but the biggest impact it's actually had was I had to recalibrate what I thought was common knowledge about things, what I thought was commonly understood and was widespread. If you'd gone through high school, you understood this about narrative, you understood this about storytelling. And obviously, I've been out of high school just for a short time. It's been a wee while, but a lot has changed in what gets taught about how narrative functions. And so a lot of my base assumptions were challenged because I was talking about the things I knew with the assumption, this is what people know, and I just want to talk about it. And I had to change to talk quite a lot more about some of the fundamentals because they weren't as common knowledge as I initially assumed. And the passion that I think we all have for reading, passion takes you 99% of the way. But having that additional knowledge about things suddenly opens up a door into a new way of approaching texts and appreciating texts. And so there's been a wonderful sort of transition between things that I just had expected everyone knew and I just was going to talk about, and then moving more back toward the sort of the academic thing about explaining stuff and going through close reading techniques and things like that, that reminded me how much they enrich my reading, as well as hopefully enrich other people's.
Yeah, there is no doubt in my mind that participating in this community, booktube, whatever you want to call it, has made me a better teacher. I have no doubt about it. I have found myself relating more easily to students. I feel like I'm more articulate in the classroom, and they're just it's a lot of fun. I have a lot of fun here. I had the other day a student who happened to have one of my videos suggested to her in her feed or whatever. It was a one. I started to read this manga called One Piece. Maybe you've heard of it. I don't know. It's kind of famous, I guess. I'm having a blast with it. It's just so much fun. And there's a lot of surprising depth to it as well. Tons of allusions and some really interesting theme work. But anyway, I just made these videos and they're getting some responses. And my student happened to see the video and she was like, I saw this video on my feed and it was you. And it was like, it was kind of fun to relate. And we just had a great conversation about this manga, which is a form of literature. And this is a student who's pretty bright and does well in class, but I never saw that spark before, in her eyes. And we were talking about this thing that she's excited about. She loves One Piece. And so it was a really cool conversation. So I found more ways to connect to my students because of belonging to this beautiful community. And I've found a lot of friends here as well. That's I can't express how it's invaluable, really, being part of this community and the friends, and even the nemesis, is pretty good too. So.
I just love that you guys are next to each other in the lineup on the screen.
Yeah, thank you for
but
not putting
speaking of
me in
the-
between.
It always happens. Somehow they manage to be AP's on top of Philip. They're beside each other. There's something been going on behind the scenes there, being manipulated.
Always nearby, grand conspiracy.
Moving things around.
Well, speaking of the community, I want to pull up just a couple comments here. Crystal says Janny is our favorite troublemaker. We have a lot of
How
people in the
would
comments.
she know?
A lot of people in the comments saying they're looking forward to it. We have Beth Tabler, our leader over at Before We Go blog. Thank you for joining us, Beth.
Hi, Beth.
Steve is also here. What a lineup. You're
Oh,
telling
Oh,
me.
Steve. Hi, Steve.
Oh, we love to see
Hi.
miss you, Dave.
Oh, Joanna's here as well. We just got a lot of people in the comments here. Just wanted to spotlight said community, and say that you guys really are what make these lives and everything, what they are. So thank you so much for coming by. And go ahead and drop questions in the
Just go
comments.
get
I
her.
will get to as many as I can throughout the episode. We can't always get to all of them, but we always encourage that here on Page Twoing. And speaking of comments, there was one specific question that I wanted to put up before I forgot, because it's kind of similar to a question I had as well for Janny specifically. The Audible release for April 25th, Curse of the Mist Race. Are you excited, Janny?
I am beside myself happy. We've been fighting and battling for this for years and years and years. And then I was on the edge of my seat. Would they or would they not get the very talented Colin Mace? So we have a stellar narrator. So I'm really excited for it. The book was designed to be read aloud. There's a beat and a rhythm to the prose. And so I think Colin is the perfect voice to deliver that. So, yeah.
You sold me on it. The Fantasy Thinker is also here. But actually, something that Philip said, I want to start with a more finite point and then broaden it out for anyone to answer. With One Piece, that was a question that I actually had for you, because I watched one of your most recent videos, and you mentioned, sorry, my baby is still hungry.
All good.
My apologies to everyone. So if you hear her, she's in the background having her breakfast. Just a disclaimer for those watching.
Those are beautiful sounds. We love those sounds.
Oh, yay. Yeah. I like them too. So, but when you were talking about One Piece, you mentioned what you just mentioned before, how it's an interesting storytelling medium, and how that medium in which a story is told really changes the way that narrative can be worked, the way that, themes can be brought out. Manga has an extra element of a visual as well. So as it's your first foray into it, or as to my knowledge, one of your first forays after Vinland Saga, I believe. What is it about manga specifically that you think lends itself to a different type of storytelling, if not just the visual? And then I kind of wanted to open that to others as well. All of you guys are very good at reviewing and interacting with and writing narrative. So is there a form of narrative that you enjoy the most? Is there one that you find difficult to get into? And is it part of the storytelling, that affects that? I'm really curious, your personal taste, not an objective view. If there's a narrative that you really enjoy. Like for me, video games don't work because I'm bad at them. The narrative is good, but I can't get through the narrative because I die, right? But I am a big fan of manga because I love the visual element. So yeah, I just kind of wanted to hand that off to you guys, maybe starting with Philip. What is it about manga that's working for you?
Yeah, actually, it's my 6th manga. So I'm still kind of a newbie here, but I'm feeling like I'm beginning to understand a few things. And aside from the visual aspect, which you mentioned, which I love, I grew up on comics. I grew up on primarily American comics, Marvel and DC. And so it's a form of storytelling. I also read a lot of Asterix and Tintin and some other European comics as well. So I was very receptive to reading stories, engaging with stories in this format. And the only difference is, well, there are other differences too, but there is the right to left and all of that. Of course, I'm reading in translation, but it's actually pretty cool. In the case of One Piece specifically, and also in the others as well that I've read, in Vinland Saga and in Vagabond and some of the others, the amount of these are the mangaka are clearly people in every case so far I've encountered who love stories. They love stories and they love alluding to other stories. They are just absolutely steeped in storytelling tradition, not just other manga, but in the case of One Piece, he just goes all over the place. You will find that Oda is the mangaka, the creator of One Piece, and he'll be referencing stories like Pinocchio or Jonah and the Whale or Journey into the West, or there's just all these different from all over the world, and I love that. And sometimes the references are visual, and sometimes it's in the wording. I also love the wordplay, which I'm amazed at how well the wordplay translates from Japanese to English. And I've been told by some of the people who've left comments that this is intentional on Oda's part, that a lot of that is him thinking ahead about how is this going to translate, but it's just, there's some really fun. I mean, I'm a pretty cheesy guy and I love puns, and you'll find some really, really great puns in One Piece as well. So there's just a lot of levels to enjoy this, and the humor. I have to tell you, I have not laughed so much. I can't remember the last time I've laughed as much as when I'm reading One Piece. It's also just really fun, which is sometimes it's nice to just laugh. So all of that, it just appeals to me on so many different levels. My favorite, most natural medium for storytelling, though, is definitely, I would say, the written word, the novel. That's my go-to. I'm not much of a screen. I don't engage with stories on screen very much. I will occasionally, AP will make me watch some TV show and we'll talk about it or something. But he pulls my arm and makes me do it. But I'll do it because it's fun to talk to him about it. And once in a while, I'll watch a movie once every couple of years or so, But I love books. I just love getting lost inside a book. That is my comfort, my delight. I will always love books, especially in the just the physical form. I'm terrible with audiobooks. I've tried and I've failed a few times. There's just something about the comfort of having the book in my hand, and I don't own an e-reader, so it's really for me just the physical books. For me, that's how I just naturally engage. I think the most easily is with it in the printed physical form for me. But I love stories across the board. So.
Yeah, I think I'm pretty much the same way. I definitely gravitate towards the written word. I think I saw my quota of movies this year already when we went to see Doom 2, so I guess I'll see the next one next year. But in addition to what Philip said about novels too, I've got I think a special place in my heart for short stories. And there's something special about being able to tell a compelling story in such a small page count. For example, I just read this upcoming anthology from Gemma Amor, All Who Wander Are Lost. It's a collection of horror stories that are all around like destination horror stories, traveling different places. And I'm captivated by the way that she can change her style so much from story to story. And every time, draw these compelling characters and an engrossing story. And yeah, it's just something special about that as well.
Don't mind me just writing down that anthology name for later.
Well,
Janny?
Janny, do you want to answer this then?
Well, I didn't have much access to TV. TV was barely invented, and I had two older brothers, and when they wanted to watch something they wanted to watch, anybody else was off the scale. And we had one little tiny black and white TV, and then so I naturally gravitated to books. I did not have access to comics. I haven't tried manga. Just haven't had the experience with it. So it's been the written word, it's been music, it's been pursuing things that I could do with my hands, doing things with the outdoors. And when I moved to college, I did not have a television set at all. And after college, I couldn't afford one. And I had no TV reception where I lived, and where I'm living now, there was no TV reception. So I grew up with the written word, and I was fortunate enough to go to a summer camp where my grandmother worked. So we got full scholarship to go, and they had a poetry night 2 nights a week. It was phenomenal, where I guess 16 kids would read poetry and would be schooled to read that poem all week. And then it was a contest, and then they would have a choral, and then there was points, and one team or the other would win. So I was just brought up with words and the power of language and the precision of language and what language can do and the range of emotions it can evoke, and the alchemy that happens because a word will strike one person one way with their experience behind them, and another person will bring another shade of meaning. So it's infinite. It is an infinite process of the interaction of an individual with a word, and I love that. There's common ground, but it diverges so widely. What one reader will love will piss off another one and will leave another one cold or indifferent. And so I find the interaction to be fascinating as to what it says about human nature. And we don't have TV now. It got too ridiculous.
I was just thinking that of all of the forms of narrative, I love storytelling in general across multiple media, but there's one major type of narrative that I really struggle not only to understand but to enjoy on any level, and that's dance, ballet, interpretive dance, anything like that. I can't process it. It doesn't work for me at all. But when my first academic paper was on comic books and how graphic narrative, so the use of the imagery, was telling a different story or emphasizing different aspects of the story to the written word. And so it was two different channels of information. And it was only by assimilating them that you got the full, complete what was being told. Because quite often because of training, from a literary standpoint, you have a tendency to ignore the imagery. You think that's just illustrating the scene. That's just what is happening. The important stuff is what is happening and what is being said. And yet there are so many brilliant comic artists and graphic artists who understand, no, you're coding information into this. And that was something that, seeing the reaction, this slight snobbery of people toward comic books and graphic novels and manga, was so reminiscent to me of the same sort of snobbery that was towards science fiction and horror and fantasy and romance and commercial, so-called commercial genres, that there was a lot of the turning up of the nose. And yet, when you look at cinema uses a visual narrative language. TV straddles that divide, but leans more into an auditory channel. And yeah, TV has images, but unless it's what they sort of like event TV that is written to be cinematic, most of the language is cinema. Cinema is so visual, and the auditory adds to it, but it's primarily visual. Literary, it's the word. But graphic novels and comic books can run the whole gamut of just illustrating the scene, or can actually be communicating narrative in that. And I remember spending time researching how people did this, like books by Will Eisner and things like that and what was the other one? Maybe Scott McCloud, but about the different techniques about how to draw your reader's eye to certain things, how to emphasize things in the imagery. And it was fascinating learning a new language, because there are similarities between the cinematic visual language, the drawn narrative language of things like comic books and graphic novels, dialogue in all the different forms. There are similarities, but there are such key differences as well. And how people play with them and take into account these differences and use them in different ways. It was so fascinating, and it adds so much richness to storytelling. There's not any one way to tell a story.
It's a
And
different
story-
translation. It's a different translation because as somebody who writes a word and also paints, if I want to say a concept with a painting, I approach it differently than writing. And to give you an example, if I'm writing, I see punctuation like a period as a period. And you ask me, end the sentence, I'll say put a period there. If I'm thinking visually, I'll say put a spot. If I'm writing, I will say give me some writing paper. If I'm drawing, I'll say give me striped paper. And I've actually done this. It's happened while I'm sitting at the drawing board. Somebody asked me for some writing paper, and I'll say the striped paper's in the drawer. It's a different language, but you can convey the same kind of concepts, but it's a different translation.
So I had a question, and based on what AP said, just AP, just wondering. So based on what you said about struggling with dance, do you feel that way about music and poetry, or is it just dance specifically? And also, my next comment was that Janny, you and Philip, when you guys bring AP to ICF, you got to get up with the club, man. You got to get up with the club, and you know, it may be more sloppy than artistic, but you gotta take a brother out and get him. You know what I mean? You gotta get
You're
him.
talking about dance?
You know what I
That's
mean?
in the same box as golf. I'm sorry. I will watch other people do it, but that's in the same box as golf. It probably has to do with my persnickety grandmothers and aunts or whatever expecting me to go to dancing class in high school. Oh my God. And you had to wear those stupid gloves and oh, geez, forget it. Golf, dance, you can do it. I'm not going there.
You know, I'm actually known for creating quite a buzz on the dance floor. So
Okay.
next time I see Janny and AP at ICFA, I'm gonna get them out there.
I might have to come down there just to see that. I might have to.
Philip, the funky chicken has never
Pixar
gone out of
didn't
style
happen,
for you.
Philip.
We have just discovered a new use for the mask.
Oh no!
Oh, Brian, I'm with you, brother. First round's on me, man.
Well, to answer
Also,
Pale's
I'm sorry,
question
AP.
there.
Just before we moved on from the narrative question, real quick, this made me giggle. Mitch says cave while paintings are where it's at for narrative. So I just had to put that shout out up there. By all means.
It's just dance. I was lucky enough when I was much younger to have studied music, so I have a rudimentary understanding of music, and I can follow it, I can get it, and I'm not good at it. I'm certainly not like Joanna or anyone else who has really studied it and understands it. It's not my strength, but I have a rudimentary understanding, and I can follow those things. And when teaching poetry, like one of the tricks that we play on students is we go, right, we're going to analyze song lyrics, because there are lyricists out there who their song lyrics are just, it's poetry set to music. And there's a lot to that. So poetry is another form of literature. Song lyrics are another form of literature that is then welded to music. And for some reason, I can interpret that slightly better. But dance is just something I remember as a child, my mother taking me and my younger brother to a ballet, and it didn't work. Classical music concert, fine. Musicals and opera, fine. Ballet, for whatever reason, it just didn't land for me. I don't quite get it. So, but almost all the other ones, I'm not necessarily good at understanding, but I hope I'm slightly better at understanding.
Yeah, that was a really broad question for you guys, and you nailed it. So I also wanted to bring up this comment because it matches exactly what AP was just talking about from Joanna. Analyzing song lyrics was a foundational form of narrative for me. I love analyzing metaphors and similes in lyrics with the accompaniment as an added layer of subtext, which is just such a big brain comment. Like I don't know if I've ever done that. Have I? Um, but yeah, so I also wanted to, before we move on from narrative in general, all of us tend to have a home base that is fantasy. It's not that we don't read outside of SFF, but all of us, that's kind of our comfort zone. You know, Janny, you're a juggernaut in the genre, so I think it's pretty safe to say that it's a comfort zone for you. And John, I know that you review a lot of stuff. We've also talked about both of us being into translated Japanese fiction, but I do see a lot of your reviews on Before We Go blog are fantasy. So am I safe in assuming that's your...
I would say speculative fiction in general. So yes, fantasy, science fiction. I love horror as well, but actually, I'm very passionate too about magical realism and translated Japanese fiction, as you mentioned. Haruki Murakami is one of my favorite authors, and I've got his complete collection on the bookshelves behind me. I'm really excited about his new novel coming out at the end of this year. But yeah, I just love a good book. I love the classics too. I love Dostoevsky and Zola and Tolstoy. So yeah, and anything that is kind of beautifully written, compelling characters, telling a story that gives me that emotional connection.
I'd like to step back a second, back into music, because I spent a great number of years studying bagpipes under a very, very top-notch, world-class guy. And I was fortunate to study under several who were masters of Scottish pipes and the music that Scottish pipes were written to play, which is not the small music, not the stuff you hear on the parades, not the stuff you hear behind the dancers, not the jigs and the reels and the marches. I'm talking what they call the great music, or the Pibroch, that was actually outlawed. And if you listen to that music, it's more of a statement of emotion. And if you listen to one of those pieces done well, played by an expert, where the pipe is tuned and it's all lined up, it's like going into a meditative state, and it will put you in an altered consciousness. It is very, very powerful, and there's not a word to be seen, and there's not even a phrase that's recognizable to the way the smaller music is written. It takes a theme, it states the theme, and then it keeps delving back into that theme with increasing complexity. And some of them are half an hour long. So sometimes creating an emotion can have no lyrics, no words at all.
That's beautiful. I've actually seen a video of you playing the bagpipes, and you're really good. So that was a lot of fun. But I find some similarities there too. I'm a medievalist by trade, I guess you could say, and some of my favorite literature, if you want to call it that, and it's almost a misnomer in this case, because a lot of my favorite poetry it emerges. It's definitely a product of literacy on some level, but it emerged from oral formulaic tradition. And these are poems that were said or recited by a bard with a musical instrument, a type of harp. We'd call it a lyre probably, but people gathered around the fire listening to the bard revive one of the old tales while tell the ancestors, bringing them back to life. And there is a meditative, almost a kind of like you were saying with the music. They're in this zone there. They're being transported while they're hearing these words float by, and the words are in a kind of a chant, right? So there's a communal aspect to it as well, along with the music. You can transport a whole room of people with music, and I think the same is true when you have a story like Beowulf being recited by a bard, that sort of thing. So there is something wonderful and communal. You're bringing everyone together with this story, and with a sense of community as well. That's really important, that they're being rooted in their ancestry through this song that's been passed down for generations and generations. There's something just beautiful I find in that.
The whole tradition of balladry.
Yep.
That's incredible.
Massive amount of material.
I can see a paper in defense of Tolkien's songs, yes. And then just that's
Do
the clip that we put in there.
Songs are great. I love having songs in my fantasy.
I hate to burst your bubble on that. There's already about 50 papers on that exact topic.
Yep, and to probably the comments are exploding because John, them's fighting words to some of those readers.
Yeah.
Don't get them started on epigraphs.
Oh,
I love epigraphs. And prologues too.
Oh, this is one of the
Oh boy, here we go. We're lit now.
here we go.
We got the AP with the. Here we go.
This is one of the things that stunned me is when you start looking at literature, even within a genre, like if you just take fantasy and you go, right, but fantasy is still as like a single genre absolutely huge and it runs the gamut. And then you have these people advertising online as editors going, don't have a prologue. Don't.
An editor said that?
Yeah, don't use epigraphs because that's breaking up the flow. And
them's fighting words.
It frustrates me because, okay, in some books or in some narratives, yeah, you can absolutely understand that introductory sort of prologue you did. That doesn't work as a prologue. Maybe do this thing instead, or just change it to chapter 1. It works as chapter 1. Or in fact, cut out the prologue and cut out chapter 1 and start your story at chapter 2, because that's really where you get going. And a lot of the stuff there you don't actually need. And it's implied by what you deal with later on. But it's these arbitrary rules that are being drawn up and then enforced as concrete rules, as if this is how stories function. And it's so incredibly frustrating because they get promulgated because they're simple bumper sticker, little tiny aphorisms. And they stick in your head and go, oh, that's the rule. There's the rules. I must follow the rules. But any great artist knows, and narrative is an art form. Any great artist knows. You know the general principles. You understand why those things evolve because it's talking and expressing an effect it has on readership, on your audience, on your narrative. But if you understand that, then you know which rules to break, why you break them. You understand what epigraphs are doing. You understand what the insertion of poetry is doing. You understand what your chapter divisions are doing. It's not a chapter must be 4.5 pages long. No, but people approach it as a mechanical list of these are the things. And I think quite often it's because if you've attended a creative writing class as an undergraduate, or you've done introduction to literature and you get introduced to the basics, and someone goes, narrative structure, let me explain narrative structure. Here is Freytag's pyramid. The problem is, as an undergraduate at 18 years old, when you hear that, you go, oh, well, that's what narrative structure is. I've memorized the thing. But it's the same as any subject. That's just scratching the surface, because no introduction to any subject is going to go, right, we're going to go into narrative structure and Freytag's pyramid and all the other structures. That's too much information. It has to be an introduction. It has to be a little tiny bit. And it's something that, you get given and gets explored. But because we half remember that stuff, it then turns into, well, that's what the thing is. And it becomes very, very frustrating then when you sort of go, oh, well, I'm doing this, blah, 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 I'm talking about this. So, well, that's not what that means.
Yeah, but that's like saying you can make a painting or break it with a picture frame. And some paintings can have no picture frame at all and function very beautifully. Now, that's the same analogy as whether you use a prologue, an epilogue, an epigram. It is framing the narrative. And I'm appalled if there was ever an editor anywhere that claimed to know their stuff, and I hope they're listening, that would dare to say, don't ever use these techniques because they can be very powerful. It is a frame. So think of all of the pictures in your life that you ever looked at. A frame can make or break a painting.
And
there's that troublemaker aspect. She's throwing hands already.
But using even a frame narrative, so placing your narrative within another narrative and creating a different diegetic level, creating a hypodiegetic level. But as you're reading and you're on that hypodiegetic level, which as you're reading, you're assuming is the main diegesis. So you're reading it as a standard narrative level. And then you cast your memory back and go, hang on a sec, this isn't a frame narrative. And that frame narrative can actually change your perception of what is happening. And you end up with a dual narrative then. And, that can be a wonderful technique. But like all of these different techniques and all of these different rules, they can be implemented badly. And the thing is, it's not the technique that's the problem. It's the fact that it's been done badly. That's what the word badly means. Oh, it is so on it. Like, oh, I don't mind that thing except when it's done badly. Well, what thing do you like when it's done badly? Out of interest. These asinine generalized statements, and you go, but you realize that that's absolutely meaningless. I don't like bad things. Okay. Like,
You look at it, Philip.
well, he is a nemesis. But and so when people try to, I understand when you're trying to explain something, you try to find like a small aspect and you try to explain it. But it's when people go, that small explanation, they have reduced down the complexity. It's become a reductionist, overly simplistic, granular approach where people don't think that world building and characterization and dialogue and narrative point of view and structure, they're all intertwined. People sometimes think that these are separate things, and you go, no, we break them up into separate things in order to talk about them. But ultimately, they are all intertwined. It is all part of narrative. Narrative is the cohesive whole. And we're trying to segment out things to make it easier to talk about. And it's the same, like making bite-sized chunks. But you carve it up into bite-sized chunks to make it easier to talk about, to assimilate, to deconstruct. But ultimately, you have to put everything back together again and go, does it function as a whole? Is it greater than the sum of its parts? Because when it is done well, narrative exceeds the sum of its parts. And that's the beauty of it. And so many of these people offering writing advice and editing advice, they're focused on the trees and they are not seeing the forest. And yeah, you can get great use out of, if you're writing and go, oh, well, I hadn't thought of that, or I hadn't heard that rule before. That might help me with my writing. And I'm sure it will, because we all have to start somewhere and we all have to go on a journey. But ultimately, if you think that it's a concrete rule, that is going to harm your writing in the long run. And it's going to harm your reading in the long run, because you're going to go, that's not how this thing is done. This is done badly. You're like, no, it's not. It's a different technique. Look at what is being evoked by it. And that's why looking at how authors create writing, as well as looking at how readers interpret writing, understanding those different perspectives gives you a greater appreciation no matter what it is that you are doing with the narrative. And then those things can apply to film, to television, to computer games, to manga, to comic books, because you start to understand more and more about how narrative actually functions. And you understand that as much as I like or dislike something, my personal approach, I am one reader out of all readers. And an author
but
is
it's separating not the sheep from the wolves, the chickens from the wolves, because there are always going to be people who are frightened to be outside their known territory. And awakening that courage to look beyond where they've gone before is the challenge that we face continuously. So yeah, that's why they feel comfortable with these hard, fast rules. That's why they say, we don't want anything that's going to push the boundaries. So it's really a case of the chickens and the wolves.
And, I'm really curious as to how, that's a really good point, going outside of your comfort zone and knowing where your comfort zone is, right? So like AP, you mentioned, ballet is just not it for you. And there's nothing you can really do about that. But recognizing that is something that I think a lot of us...
I try it again every once in a while, and I do try, but I have yet to succeed.
It's like eggplant for me.
Yes, someone else who feels the same way about eggplant. Yes, Philip, I feel you on that.
I can't. I'm sorry.
But I wanted to something that a lot of us do in our own little realms, whether it be on video or on Before We Go blog or whatever. We write reviews. So there was actually a question from Beth, speaking of Before We Go blog earlier, that goes nicely with this. What book was the most difficult for you to review and why? Because we are subjective readers, and even if objectively you can recognize what someone's doing, it might not be for you. So when you have a difficult book, a book is difficult for you anyway. How do you handle that as a reviewer?
Oh, wow. I would say the most difficult one that I've had recently it's probably this one. Mark Lawrence's The Book That Broke the World. So I got my hard copy here, but I was reading this as an electronic ARC right around Christmas time. And, whenever I get a great book like this, I'm taking pages and pages of notes, and it's difficult to try to do it justice. It's like, actually, some of your books too, like Philip, when I was reviewing your books, or PL with yours, that I just, there's so many wonderful aspects to all of these books, and figuring out how to convey that in a way that will do those books justice, and convey that passion that I have for the books. That is always a challenging thing for me, and it becomes even more difficult when you're dealing with a sequel book like this, where you don't want to spoil anything in the first book, for people who haven't started. So giving the right amount of information to try to convey the points that I want to convey, but without ruining anything for the readers. That's often difficult, and for me, it's just as difficult to write about books that I love as maybe books that I really don't love. With those, I always try to find at least 2 or 3 nice things to say about them, even if the books didn't work. Try to convey what didn't work about them in as constructive a fashion as possible. But on the other end of the spectrum, just trying to do justice for something that is such a wonderful work of art is often a challenge. So I always feel like I'm falling short, but I'm trying my best.
I don't think anyone could do as well as you do, John, on those reviews.
Thank you.
Yeah, John, you are in a class by yourself as a written. When it comes to the written reviews, I think a lot of us would acknowledge in this space when it comes to written reviews. There's Esme, Rosaline. She is definitely, a fabulous reviewer of I'm only speaking written. I'm speaking booktube. Beth Tabler, our wonderful leader, who's in the chat somewhere, and John. I think universally mentioned the 3 of them in our court. There's others, of course, but universally, I think, mentioned in our corner of the book world as being fabulous with the book world.
Yeah.
Thank you, Crystal.
To answer your question, Taylor, I just finished reading and reviewing. The review is not out yet. It's for SPFBO, and it was one of the finalists. And it was a book that I had to really, for this one, separate my own personal tastes and biases in order to, I felt, give a fair review to this book, which I think would be really great for a certain audience. It's not my preferred sort of thing, but I had to separate that out. And I'm fascinated by, AP and I have discussed this before among ourselves, but how there's this spectrum, I think, of pure objectivity on one side and pure subjectivity on the other side. And maybe pure objectivity in reviewing is actually impossible, but you can get closer to that side and I'm attempting to do that as I'm reviewing this book, which is just not my thing. And I tried my best to like it, but it's really not my thing. So at the same time, I recognize that it has merit, and that I think there's an audience that would really love this book. So I try to pick out, okay, what are the things that it does well, and how does it do that? And I try to be as objective about that as possible. But we can't completely separate our personal tastes. We can go a ways toward that, I think. By talking about narrative technique and by trying to analyze the characters and try to analyze what works. This is setting great. How about the world building? You can talk about all those things and thereby sort of separate yourself from your personal enjoyment, which is a product of your own taste to some degree. So that I find interesting to sort of look at. How does that work?
Most difficult review I ever would have to write. You will never see it. Never. In a snowball's chance in hell will you see that review, because those books were, in my personal opinion, so badly written. I could not say anything that would help the person or even help the readership to find such a book. And the one thing I've learned in the years I've been around is No matter how fumbling and clumsy and bad a person's start is, you can never, ever predict where they're going to end up. I'm in the process right now of inventorying all my early papers, early drawings. If you saw the things that I messed with in my late teens, early 20s, you would never believe that I could write like I do now or draw like I do now. So I will never, ever knock a book for being badly written. I just won't say anything, because the last thing I want to be is play God and pour cold water over somebody's starting effort. If I dislike a book, I'm going to really, really analyze why. And often it has to do with me. Always it has to do with me, actually. There's a reason why I don't care for it. But I can always spot the theme. I can always see merit in it. I can always see from the angle of what would this book have read when I was a kid or a teen. So I try to direct that book to its audience. But I've stopped putting stars on any books. I will not put a star rating. I will always comment on a book. But those books I can't comment on, I will never write down what I thought. It's not for me to play that role, because criticism always hurts. And I know there are a lot of people who review that think it's their God-given purpose to criticize books. It's not mine. My book is to connect the love of that book to its audience that's going to lovingly receive it. Or if I get the chance, encourage that person to create and keep creating until practice makes perfect. Because you can never tell from an early effort or even a middling effort. Art takes a long time to form, and it takes a lot of time to find a voice. So I do not consider myself a critic. I do not consider myself a reviewer. I'm a reader.
Well, weirdly enough, the reviews that I always find easiest to write were reviews of books that I loathed, because at least I was having a visceral reaction. And usually because of that, I would double down and go, why do I hate this book so much? And I would break everything apart and focus on it. The next level down of book that was relatively easy to write about were books that I loved, because again, there was a visceral reaction. I was reacting to it with joy, but I had to be so much more careful to go into the analysis to find out why I was doing that, instead of just going, oh yeah, I just really enjoyed this. The books that were most difficult ever to write reviews for were the books that were meh. The ones that didn't have that reaction, that I was looking at going, it's thin. There isn't a lot of theme to this. It's disposable. It does what it says on the tin, but there's nothing more to it than this. And those were the ones that were always difficult to write, because there was nothing really standing out about it. If you loathed it, there was loads to talk about. If you loved it, there was loads to talk about. But a book that left zero impact, you're like, it exists. And those were incredibly difficult reviews for me to write, because there was nothing to latch on to. But even in books that I vehemently disliked, I tried not to be negative. I tried not to be mean, because a good rule of thumb, and I know I've heard Philip say this before, and I will acknowledge my nemesis on this one occasion. But if you're reviewing a book, would you say that, if allowed, if the author was sitting with you? And the thing is, if you can honestly look at it and go, right, if that human being was sitting there, how would I phrase, if you didn't like the characterization, or you thought the characterization was bad, how would I phrase that in a way where I can get that point across? Because I'm not going to lie about it, but in a way that is politely communicating it, instead of saying, this person can't write characters. Well, that's not the same as characterization, but aside from that point, but trying to find a way to communicate your evaluation of it that will be useful for other people to read, and it's not necessarily tied into how you felt about it, because we all have bad days. I've had a spate of them recently, and on those bad days, I am grumpier than normal. I am more irritable, and I react badly to things, and I overreact to things, and I can be overly acerbic. Right. So when I'm reading a book and I have that reaction, was that because I read it on a bad day? Or does the book actually deserve that vehemence and that acrimony? So you look at it again and you take it apart. But the books that have nothing to them, that it's just stuff happens and it resolves, that those are the hardest reviews to write because there's nothing to latch on to.
Yeah. And I think that brings me to my burning question for the four of you. One of the many burning questions. But so when I thought about this episode and I thought of the four of you specifically, all of you would argue are extremely accomplished outside of the book space. And, Janny, I would argue you're an iconic author, and your wealth of life experience, I mean, you essentially have a PhD in literature, on the practical sense, based on, your body of work alone and how intellectually written it is. And besides that, I mean, you're an accomplished equestrian, you're an accomplished painter, you've had your art hang in notable art galleries. You talked about the bagpipes, you're exceptional there. You do search and rescue, you do all these things. And then we have at the bottom of the screen, we have 3 PhDs. And, I believe Philip and John, you also have been or are department heads. And, AP, you're a lawyer by trade, and you're a sought after developmental editor, and you've done all these things. Your resumes read like, it's mind boggling. And I'm sure you've had pressures in those other areas of life. And it was just so great to hear John talk about, after writing all these scholastic, things, it's like, oh, I can kind of, get into the booktube world, right? But what I want to say, and this is where the question is leading, is that I look at you, I think Taylor would agree, and I think a lot of people in the chat would agree, that I look up to all four of you, and I look to you as leaders in our little book space. And what you say carries weight, regardless of what you're talking about. Yeah, you, AP. Yeah, you. Yeah, you.
No pressure. No pressure.
No pressure. And that's my point. Do you feel pressure? You've just displayed the way you articulate yourselves, the stances you take. You're not afraid to be unpopular. You're not afraid to, even because you are so smart, all of you, to sound pretentious. You're not scared to take stances. You show leadership in everything you do in our space, and we all look up to you. Does that come with pressure? Not talking about outside the book space, does it come with pressure with your writing, Janny? Be someone who, when you put out a tweet about literature, people are watching and listening. For the three of you, with what your comments, your analysis about literature, your reviews, etc., is there pressure to be, I would argue, leaders, notable leaders in this book space? Does that come with pressure of the responsibility of being? And you may not think of yourselves as that, and perhaps that's the other side of it, but how do you feel about that?
I wore out that old sweater a long time ago. Long time ago. I used to be terrified to get up in front of anybody. I went through whole years in high school where I talked to no one. I said almost no words in public. I interacted with animals. I interacted with outdoors. I read books. I hated interacting with people. I got over it. Musical instruments, piping competitively, playing ballads in bars where I was hired to play, got me over it. And what got me over it quicker than that too was publishing books, because you can't sand off the edges to please everyone. You're not going to please everyone. And growing up in a family that was very critical and very competitive and very quick to point out your flaws, you learn to grow out of it. Because if you stay in that cellophane wrapper all your life, you don't get to live. So that lesson has to come hand in hand with kindness, because you have to understand that when you throw away that cellophane and that plastic bag and you step out into the world and you have opinions, it can be rough on the people around you. And I'm not afraid to say something and call the shots in a very straight line. I'm not afraid to piss people off, but is it necessary? And was there a point? So learning that kindness and realizing the impact that you're carrying is an important balance, counterweight. So I don't feel the pressure, but I try to think outside myself.
That's beautifully said. Really beautifully said. To me, the best leaders are servants, and the best teachers are students. And I try to learn from everyone that I'm around. I know that whenever I'm in a conversation with people, I have something to learn, no matter the person. I learn from my students every semester. I've developed such an appreciation for certain stories because of what they've said in classes and what they've written in papers. They bring their own unique experiences to those stories and help me to appreciate them more. So my attitude is I try to be always learning. And if that looks like leading from from the outside, great. I won't claim to be any kind of a great leader or anything, but I do love learning. I do love interacting with people. I try to do so with a sense of humility and gratitude for the people I'm around. So yeah, that's how I look at it, and I feel fortunate to be around such wonderful people.
Very well said, and thank you, PL, for all the really nice comments. And I hope you know that everything you express, those feelings are mutual toward you as well, and toward Taylor. And I'm quite sure that all of us feel the same way towards both of you. I guess my perspective is, we just have this one life to live, right? And all of us have diverse interests. All of us have things that we want to pursue. And it would be a shame if we went through all of life and didn't have the chance to pursue those interests and to meet people in these new communities. And, when it comes to leadership, I think, leading by example is just the right way to go because we create the community collectively, all of us, right? And if each one of us treats each other the way that we want to be treated and does the things that we want other people to do, if we're all leading by example, then that creates the community that is positive and constructive for everyone.
There's that attitude of paying it forward too. I mean, I've sat on a good number of panels on a good chunk of conventions, audiences big and small, and just watching the faces as the other panelists talk. And one thing I learned early on is you're not up there to talk about yourself. You're up there to pave the way, to give the people who are listening or asking you questions something they can take home that will make their life better, something that will encourage them, something that will carry them forward or take them through a rough patch. And so that feeling of when you're in front of a microphone or you're in a panel, you're not there. Philip said it perfectly. You're there to serve. You're there to add to the experience of the collective.
Before I started this, to correct one thing, I was never a practicing lawyer. I got my law degree, and I have worked for law firms, but I didn't take the equivalent of the bar exam. I worked in office in a law firm, but when it comes to, I don't see myself as a leader. I am one of a community, and we all add our own perspective, knowledge, understanding, and appreciation of literature. That's what we do, and it's one of the strongest things about how the modern world has changed, in that 40 years ago, reading was essentially a solitary thing. You got a book, you sat down, you read it, you thought about it, you formed opinions about it. But because of social media, because of advances in technology, reading has become a lot more communal. And like, having sort of trained during that transition, it's been phenomenal. So the number of people who say things like, "Oh, but so and so recommended this," and you're like, "But why does that matter? Are you interested in it? What does their opinion on it matter?" So I am not the arbiter of anything. I'm not the decider of things, and I try to steer clear. Although I feel because unfortunately I am human and I am fallible. I have problems with that. I'm meant to be omniscient and infallible. Something went wrong. But ultimately, I try not to say this is bad or this is good, because there are different ways of approaching it. And I can look at techniques and explain what the technique is doing and going, and it's doing it very well. And, that leads to us saying this is good. But for most of us, when we are reading or watching TV or watching a film or any of these things, whether something is good or bad is not the major reason a lot of the time. It's whether we enjoy it or not. And enjoyment is not predicated on good or bad. And if there's anything that I try to lead on is making that decision. I don't like that thing, therefore it is bad. Or I do like that thing, therefore it is good. Oh, that thing is bad. How can you like it? Those judgments are not useful, because what we enjoy, what we derive entertainment from or enjoyment from, is going to be personal. And if someone can find a way to enjoy something that we loathe, let them have that. It's not about their taste. It's not about their preferences, or they aren't discerning enough. There's enough snobbery in the world without people who love literature setting up these arbitrary things for people to be tested on. A shibboleth. Are you a true fan? You're like, go away. I'm reading a book and I'm enjoying it. I don't need to prove my credentials. There's so much beauty and wonder in what we read. And people setting up these arbitrary concrete fences and barriers and tests as if that is the thing. And you go, the one thing I remember doing, one of the things I like doing on the channel is taking the prologue or the opening of a book. And there's a book series, and I'll tell you straight off, the Sword of Truth series by Terry Goodkin. It is not a series I like. It is a series I actually dislike. And I don't think it's particularly well written. But there are lots of people who love it. So if I did an analysis of what he was doing on that first page and went, this is all rubbish, you go, that's not helping anyone. That's just me making myself feel better and having a vent about how much I dislike it. But by going through it and go, here's this thing. We're told to have a hook. Look at this first line. It was an odd looking vine. That mightn't be a hook for you, but you can see it's emphasizing this thing. And then here, this is an exposition dump because suddenly we're taken out of the scene. We're given all of this backstory and it's just loaded in here. And a lot of readers like that. You describe the thing and then you'll have some idiot going, oh, well, AP really liked that book. And you go, you're about as discerning as a grapefruit. Because if you can't understand the difference between seeing what is there and understanding that there are other readers out there who don't like the same things that you do, then you have a very egocentric and myopic view of the world. But me trying to describe those things, I try to hide it, and obviously I don't always, but I try to show what the thing is doing, because it is not up to me to tell you or anyone else what you should like, what you shouldn't like. I can tell you what I like, what I dislike. I can tell you what I see in a work or what I don't see in a work. I can tell you based on my experience and training what I think is being done well or what I think is being done badly. But none of these things are concrete. They're all based on what I know and what I've experienced. And I am surrounded on a daily and weekly and monthly and annual basis by people who know far more than me, who are smarter than me, who are better read than me, who know the genre better than me. I am surrounded by people in all walks of life who know things that I don't know. I never think of myself as a leader because I still am a student. I still have so much to learn. And if you look on that Dunning-Kruger graph, I'm way down at the bottom going, I have this entirety of this graph to learn before I feel I will be in a position to be an arbiter of this is what this is. Because literature is vast. And I'm not even just studying literature. I'm studying narrative, which is even more vast. and it is infinite in its variety.
That's absolutely.
Well, now we need 2 T-shirts. I'm sorry, we need 2 T-shirts. You're about as discerning as a grapefruit, and it's going to be lit.
You're
All
about
right,
as discerning as a
I always like the
This-
Buckminster Fuller quote: "Only insects specialize. We're individuals for a reason, so celebrate it."
Yeah, no, that's the point. You all are so it's amazing to listen to you all. I'm wondering, and we know there's a lot of really exceptionally intelligent people, as AP and John and Philip and Janny have all pointed out, in our community, and there's a lot of great writers, and all of you have, to a certain extent, you've all dabbled in the academic world as well, and you've read a lot of nonfiction and all kinds of books. What are the books that have challenged you? They can be, again, scholastic, on the scholastic side, the academic side. They can be, textbooks. They can be, obviously, we love to talk about fantasy specifically and speculative fiction, etc. They can be those kind of books. What are the books that you have read recently that have challenged you, intellectually, changed your assumptions, or maybe something that is an area of expertise that you're trying to research, but it was tough? Like, what are some of the books that have like challenged your brains the last little while? Anybody want to go first?
I mean, so many. The first one that pops to mind is by a fellow named Douglas Hofstadter. And it's Gödel, Escher, Bach, The Eternal Golden Braid, I think it's called. And this was written in the 1970s, by a fellow who's, I think he's actually a computer scientist by trade, but he wrote this book about consciousness, which is a subject I love. I love reading about, brains and about the universe and consciousness and stuff like that. And he came up, basically, he's approaching the issue of consciousness from the perspective of his own field, computer science, but also, as the title implies, Gödel is a famous mathematician, so he's using math. Escher, MC Escher, the artist, is using art, and Bach, he's using music. And he's approaching the idea of consciousness from these different fields, all with this idea of loops. He calls them strange loops, and that consciousness is sort of self-reflective in a sense. It's just, it was immensely challenged by, especially the mathematical parts, because I haven't done math since high school, which was in the 1980s. So it's been a little while. Yeah, I just love reading stuff like that. And I do find it challenging. But I think it also enriches me in ways that I can't even predict, because it'll end up in my own writing, at times. I don't even know where it's going to come in, but it'll end up there, reading stuff like that, reading stuff about the brain or about the universe or whatever. It's fun how that stuff ends up being part of my just the soup that's swirling around in this whatever's between these two ears. I mean, it just comes out in the most fascinating way. So I love challenging myself with reads like that.
I think the Quincunx, I forget who the author was. It's like reads like a calculus text for trying to figure out what's happening. I would challenge anyone to read that book from cover to cover and figure out everything that you need to know to figure out the riddle that's in the middle of it. That was probably the most recent book that put my brain into a bender. And I read that one, 20 years ago? I'm not talking nonfiction or things like that, because when I delve into nonfiction, often it's because of hands-on, offshore navigating, or learning all the principles behind what your little GPS unit does, and really understanding what that unit is doing. But that's challenging in a different way, and that's easily graspable if you focus. But if you want to talk a fiction book, it would be the Quincunx, hands down. I would pick as tying my brain in a knot.
I guess for me, I just grabbed one that's on my desk here that I've been studying a lot. This is actually by my colleague here at Penn State, Longqing Chen, Thermodynamic Equilibrium and Stability of Materials. So this field goes back, many, many decades. And but there's still so much that isn't understood about this field of thermodynamics. And my colleague he is so passionate about it, and he understands this field better than anyone else I know. And he has the passion of um, trying to convey that information in a way that as many people can understand as possible. And when he published this, I think 2 years ago, for me, it's just like an instant classic. It's like, this is the book that I should have had when I was studying this. And we're currently working together now too to write up some small papers to try to give this out to the broader community. And I'm learning so much in the process of working with him, and we're trying to write it in a way that is going to be engaging and tell the story the way that pulls the reader in and wants them to see what happens. So taking these things that we learn about narrative from the fiction space and trying to bring it into the scientific space for a field that is so fundamental to everything around us, and yet is traditionally very difficult to understand.
AP?
There is a book that every couple of years I try to reread. Baudrillard's Simulacra and Simulation. For whatever reason, I cannot get through it. I try over and over again. It is my Sisyphean hill. And I don't know what it is about this one particular one, but I struggled with that. But in terms of fiction, R. Scott Baker's Neuropath was, I described it at the time as a book that made me want to bleach my brain. It created a very visceral reaction in me. And it's a powerful book because of that. But the implications of what Baker was discussing in that novel, what he was exploring in that novel, were just frightening. And that one lived deep, dark in my subconscious for a while and was incredibly troubling until I went, no, just forget it. Just forget. Think about something else. But one of the things, being an editor is weird because you get books written by people and they have their field of interest. And so you find yourself looking up stuff on how AI actually functions, on quantum mechanics, on medieval underwear. The search history that Google has for me, like every once in a while, I feel like typing in "Dear FBI." I am researching for someone's work. Please don't ask me why I'm looking up how quickly a body decomposes in a swamp. Like, you have these really weird things, and I find like some of the stuff. I go, right, I'll look at this paper on it, this academic paper, and I get halfway through and I go, no, I'm going to go back and I'm going to find a textbook that explains this. I go, no, I'm going to go back. I'm going to find an introduction to this. Get through the introduction.
No, you just call the guys who run the body farms. You ever heard of a body farm? That's where they take corpses and they put a raccoon cage over them, and they actually measure these things, how long it takes for this or that to decompose, and they use them to train the dogs and so on. So yeah, you don't have to go to a textbook for that. You can get your hands real dirty.
But one of the reasons I know about body farms was because I was doing a whole bunch of searches on this about 15 years ago, and then answering questions from the police. But then I found a wonderful documentary that explained a lot of it. So it's weird. The number of times you find something and you just go, I don't have the foundational concepts that allow me to interpret this. So it's then tracking back in time to making it sort of more general and easier each time to see when are my foundational concepts sort of appropriate and how much do I have to teach myself to get up to the thing that I need to know. And that is a fun process.
For the record, I don't know anything about body farms.
I'm sure Paul does.
Unfortunately, much. but what I did know, and I knew, and it's so fascinating. All of your answers fascinating. Thinking of R. Scott Bakker, who again, an author that I feel that when I finish reading his works, that he'll probably be one of my top authors. I've read much by him, but but I don't think of him as an academic. But that's what he is. He's a lecturer at Western, which is not too far. I lived in London, where that university is, and he is brilliant. And but we think in the book community, we think of him as this grim, dark author, but he's a brilliant academic, and it's just fascinating to hear someone like AP. And again, it's one of those things where you think about, I look at, Taylor and I affectionately dubbed this episode "Big Brain Energy" because of the intellectual capacity we assign to you four in the community, and I think that's no secret. I know you're too modest to acknowledge that, but that's the reality. If we took a poll of all the people watching, they'd say, "Are these four really smart people?" And everybody would say, "Yeah." And there's lots of smart people in the community, but it's funny to hear AP talk about something that stretched him to his limit with someone who we think of, okay, and I don't want to say just a fiction author, but this is also someone who, like all of you, has dabbled in the academic world. So I thought that was fascinating.
I don't know, PL. You haven't seen me put together IKEA furniture, so.
It's also fascinating to hear from a professional capacity, engaging with a book like that, because, I read one of my favorite science fiction books is Children of Time. But when I tell you, there were a couple sections where I was like, I'm going to just take your word for it. I'm going to agree with you that's how that works.
Yeah.
I'm like, I'm just going to say that, yeah, I trust you. That's how that works, right? So I think it's interesting hearing it from a professional perspective, because you read it from, a perspective of this is just for enjoyment, or, a personal review capacity. I was having this discussion actually with a private book club that I do. We don't do lives or anything like that, but we were talking about how, like, some languages, when there's a lot of consonants next to each other, you just make a mumble sound in your head and you move on, because you're like, I'm not even going to try with that. And I feel like fantasy books have a lot of that as well. But when you're engaging in a professional capacity, you can't really do that. So it's cool to hear you kind of reflect on that, because I think personally we all do that. Fantasy worlds, you're like, I'm gonna just kind of not gonna.
Grasshopper readers do that. They jump over things because they want to be in a hurry to get through it. But you lose the magic of a book if you don't let the book take you.
Mm-hmm.
You got to surrender to what's on the page, and if it's done well, that surrender is complete. But if you're a grasshopper reader and you leap over it, how are you ever going to be stretched?
Well,
how are you ever going to set foot on unknown territory?
Johnny, I have meant to ask you about this. I think this might be the perfect opportunity. The fantasy apostrophe in people's names. This is something I have seen in your work. The fantasy apostrophe in people's names. Why? What is it? A glottal stop? It's like you know the reason for it.
I do, and I can't speak for all the other authors out there. I absolutely can't. I'm not a linguist, but I did engineer the language in the Wars of Light and Shadows to demonstrate the flow of energy, the flow of consciousness. It is a language of power. It demonstrates the flow and makeup of consciousness. So you would have to go back to the root meaning and the derivative word that led to the word that's on the page, and the reason why it's broken the way it is, because it's devolved from that original language, what we could call actualized language. So there is purpose. You could ask me in private or not on a forum like this where we don't want to pull it to one side, exactly why I did what I did. Everybody else, I don't know why they're doing it. You'd have to ask them. But for me, it was extremely purposeful.
Well, because we all know Philip would be Philip, but with a PH and then the apostrophe and then LIP. There we've just made a fantasy name out of Philip's name. And I know I have seen that in certain, but with your writing, that it feels different, because
it is different. It is different. It was not arbitrary, and there were certain things that you can't do with our alphabet. You can't put a T and a TH. There was actually a TH symbol. So you could do T and TH, and so yeah, you have to put a hyphen between that, because otherwise it's gibberish. You'll never get the pronunciation. So nothing was arbitrary.
I think it was George Bernard Shaw in his will, and it's actually one of the cases that set a precedent for what you were allowed to leave in a will in the UK for charity purposes. But in his will, he bequeathed money to develop a 32-letter English alphabet to correct some of the issues with the English alphabet. And the court ruled that they didn't have to do that. They could use it for some other purpose. But I think it was R.E. Shaw's will was the case.
I must say that two comments I want to make quickly. I must say that you talk about works that challenge you when in all the right ways. Here we have an author that does it for me. And also it's this one was fantastic too. But we cannot be denied prologues because I have it on the shelf there. But we wouldn't have we would be denied the prologue in The Way of a Dan, and that would be a travesty because it's one of the best prologues I've ever read. I'm holding up the Return of a Dan, but the prologue, I've said that in my review, the prologue in The Way of a Dan is one of the best.
Philip, you kept the prologue? I told you, as an editor, you don't do prologues. Like there's a rule. You just don't do prologues or put in songs.
John, what do you think about prologues? I think you're the only real editor on this panel besides AP. Do you have a different... AP is an editor, but you are too.
Real editor.
No, I meant editor for an actual magazine where he is the buying editor, yeah?
So
no, not...
I'm a big fan of
Slips of the
prologues.
tongue. Here we go.
Editor.
I'm sorry, AP.
I do want to point out that, Jenny, you do have these wonderful glossaries in the back of all the books in the Wars of Light and Shadow, where you can look up somebody's name and you can see the root words for that name, the etymology, as it were, which is really cool. That's part of what you were talking about, I think, in your response to AP. So, really
I would love to have AP as an editor. I would love it.
Are you sure about that?
I think you should hire John instead, firstly.
But my question goes back to John. What do you think about prologues and epigrams and epilogues and lyrics in the middle of a page of text?
Give me all of the above, please. As long as it, is serving the narrative and enhancing the experience. When it comes to epigraphs, I'll go back to this one. And the book one in this series too. I would be happy with just a book of epigraphs. They're beautifully written. It helps to enhance the world. It helps to deepen the story. And same thing with prologues too, especially if they are, providing some different perspective that is going to come back later in the narrative.
So what would you say to these readers that say you can never have those things? And they stamp their boots on the floor so hard it shakes the earth.
I would advise them to give it a chance and go with it and just enjoy the experience. Don't be so upset about a prologue where you don't want to have one. It's there for a reason. The authors put it there for a reason. And that's part of the experience. That's part of the book. So take it all in. And
where did we get all these rigid ideas from? Is this new from the internet, where everybody has to have these rigid opinions?
But
it always existed, but the dogpiling of it—that's the internet.
Mm-hmm.
John brought up a really, really important point. If it is in service of the narrative. The problem with that phrase, because I agree with that entirely. The problem with that phrase is a lot of people's understanding of narrative is they rephrase it as it's in service of the story. And then, so they've reduced narrative just to story. And then they reduce, it has to serve the story. And what they mean by story then is the narrative events and the plot, the narration of those narrative events, the sequence in which we encounter them. And so they take something which is, it should be in service of the narrative, which is the grand piece, and they've reduced it down to it's not moving the narrative events forward. And it's a fundamental misunderstanding. And you can see it incrementally as it goes all the way down to this reductionist bumper sticker version of it. because when we say things, well, I obviously I can't speak for John, but when we say things like it should be in service of the narrative, that's because what we are conceiving of as the narrative is all of the mechanical aspects, all of the artistic aspects, theme, subtext, context, like all of those things are part of what the narrative is. But people take that expression and they go, narrative is just story. Story is just what happens. So it has to serve what happens. And that overly reductive approach is why I think quite a lot of people look at it and they go, a prologue doesn't serve the story because the prologue isn't one of the narrative events, or it doesn't involve the central character and what they are doing. In the same way that people confuse main character, protagonist, and hero. They use those terms interchangeably. But those terms, there's a reason why they are separate terms. They have different meanings. Quite often, a single character can be multiple of those terms. But hero, main character, and protagonist are not necessarily the same thing. But we get that conflation, the reductionism, and it becomes overly simplistic.
Yeah. I'd like to point out that AP's done a lot of great videos on the prologues in Malazan and other books and series. AP and I have talked at length about some of the poems that are epigraphs in both novels of the Malazan Empire and the Malazan Book of the Fallen. And they enrich the story, they enrich the narrative so much in ways that it's wonderful. It adds layers to the storytelling. It adds understanding. It sets up themes. There's foreshadowing. There's all kinds of great stuff. One of my favorite, I had to bring up Beowulf while we're here together. Sorry guys, I can't help it. But one of my favorite poems of all time, Beowulf, if you just reduce it to the story, it's a tale of a warrior who kills a troll-like monster, the troll-like monster's mother, and then a dragon, and dies. That's it. But there are all these wonderful side stories that are thematically linked to this main narrative, and it's from these side stories that you get this rich exploration of life's fleetingness and the sense of bereavement on the part of the people of the present, looking back on the past, particularly since this was written, again, coming from oral formulaic tradition by a Christian poet, looking back on his pagan ancestors and with a sense of their courage and their honor and their loyalty, but also a sense that they were misguided by this futile, heroic code that led them to chase after glory and so on. So you miss a lot of those layers if you just say, oh, Beowulf is the story of a dude who kills 3 monsters. There's just all this other wonderful stuff going on. So anyway, I feel like you're missing a lot if you're just
you heard it here first. Beowulf is a dude, bro. Philip said it.
He's the ultimate dude, bro, man. Yeah.
Beowulf alert activated.
That's why, by the way, I think it's tough to adapt Beowulf onto the screen because if there has not been a single, in my opinion, really very good Beowulf adaptation.
You like Angelina Jolie and you,
no. Not as much as you had some real talent involved in that. Now Neil Gaiman was part of the effort there. So there was some real talent. Zemeckis was the director. They had some really good actors. Anthony Hopkins was involved.
Yeah.
John Malkovich was involved. You had some real talent, but I think it's a real failure. That film is a real failure.
Well, you had that line, "Oh, Beowulf, I'm here to kill your monster." Why is Beowulf suddenly from the East End? Like,
I don't know.
But there was a fascinating adaptation of the first part of Beowulf that was, I think it was it Beowulf and Grendel, and it was an Icelandic art house movie. And that was really wonderful, where Grendel was Neanderthal.
I have it, and it's okay. It's with who's that Scottish actor who was in 300? Gerard Butler. He plays Beowulf.
Gerard Butler.
Yeah, he plays Beowulf in that film. I would not call it a great adaptation, but we can argue about that later.
Right. We are going to have an argument about adaptation, young man. But
Okay.
what about Outlander? Was it Outlander with Jim Caviezel, the science fiction retelling of Beowulf?
Yeah.
Hmm.
Oh, you are such a snarky purist when it comes to your precious Beowulf.
Well, if you would indulge me, I'll only read these few lines. But the years have all yielded, the your days long gone, the eldest of ages, to an era less bright, when gods roamed the ground and guarded the realms, from monsters that murdered, from the malice of whites. Then warriors wielded the wisdom of old, they battled and bled, bold were their deeds. That's actually from, of course, The Return.
That's great old English poetry right there. Yeah.
Yeah.
Or
Great is overselling it. It's old English poetry. Don't oversell it.
We'd be missing something if we didn't have books that had features like poetry.
Well, I know it's so quick. It's already an hour and a half. I feel like we barely scratched the surface of everything that we wanted to engage with you guys on. Like my notes are crying because I only got to so many, a few of them. But there was one question that I really loved in the comments that I wanted to kind of close out with, because not only do you guys come from not disparate, that's the wrong word, but different fields outside of the book world, and then you bring your knowledge here. You also have a lot of experience just reading. And every time I talk to any one of you, I always feel like I get, inspired to read something new, or to try a new genre or a new author. And so someone had put up here, what are some fantasy authors that should be studied by writers that not a lot of people talk about? And I think this is just a fantastic question. So thank you for putting it in the chat. But I'd like to give you guys a chance to kind of leave us with a heavier TBR than we started with, and throw a couple names out there that you think go with that question.
Let me put forth Anna Smith Spark as someone who should be studied a lot more than she is now. So we talked about incorporation of poetry in the prose. I mean, her prose is poetry. It's just so beautifully written. And her, deep knowledge of medieval literature and everything is just out there on the page. And she tells a wonderful story with really heartfelt characters. I think she basically was the pioneer of what I would call literary grimdark. And she doesn't get nearly enough attention as she should.
She's she's sort of the Gene Wolfe of fantasy, because she plays with perspective very, very heavily in very bizarre ways. And so it's very, very deep into the psyche of our characters, where what is real and what is their perception and what is the actual event. And yeah, I would say she's a very, very deep writer that probably deserves more attention than she gets.
Well,
I would have picked. Oh, sorry, AP, go ahead.
No, Johnny, please. Well, I wanted to get in early because the chances are that Johnny will mention a couple of authors like, oh, you've just ruined my pick that I was thinking about. But Diana Wynne Jones would be an author who I think is often overlooked or not given enough credit and analysis and discussion, as well as like Patricia McKillop, like authors who really set standards and approaches for the genre, and they don't get talked about in the same breath as like Tolkien and Jordan and Brooks, and yet they should be. And it's the same with Johnny's work. Wurts is one of those authors that, yes, there is depth and complexity, and the work can sustain analysis. The work can sustain in-depth discussion and dissection and vivisection, and then it all comes back together again, and you realize you haven't even scratched the surface of it. There are so many authors who don't get talked about because they aren't the big name. And Diana Wynne Jones, like even something like the Dark Lord of Darkholme, which you can read as this wonderful parody of epic fantasy and the quest narrative, but you can also read it as a critique of capitalism because it's doing both at the same time, and you can read it as a critique of colonialism. That there are all of these wonderful aspects to it, that it sustains that level of approach because it isn't one of those meh books that has no substance. There's multiple layers to it. And that's the joy of Diana Wynne Jones. You can read it on that surface level and it can be wonderful and engaging and entertaining and funny. And then you can dig down into it a little bit and you realize there's a lot going on here that is darker and even strong thematic stuff going on. Howl's Moving Castle, another wonderful example by Jones. But Diana Wynne Jones is certainly one author I would recommend. Patricia McKillop being another, and of course Janny Wurts.
I would have put Pat McKillop one of the top of my list. She's probably the premier author of not only poetic prose but allegory. She does allegory better than anyone else in the field. The fact she never got a grandmastership is criminal. And she's way, way, way underrepresented for the quality of the work that she's done. And each of her books is a work of poetry, a work of art, but has a profound meaning behind it. And it's charmingly written. I would say, besides her, Sarah Zattel's SF has been heavily and horribly overlooked. She comes at the writing of science fiction and writing and shaping of ideas in ways that's very different, but is right up there with the best writers of science fiction, but almost nobody's read her work. Try The Quiet Invasion, try The Fool's War, she was an exquisite writer. Going back a little bit, C.J. Cherry's probably top notch for writing a psychological impact of multiple angles of view and multiple political impacts. She did The Expanse long before The Expanse was there. Her fantasy Fortress of the Eye of Time, where she comes at a complex political situation from a total innocent's eye view, is just profoundly well done, but almost not written. I would say right now it's fallen out of vogue because of certain modern sensibilities that have put a stamp on it that is wrong, because nothing in these books are gratuitous. But Stephen R. Donaldson, profound writer, explored things about the human psyche that most writers wouldn't dare touch, but he's avoided because very loud voices have dismissed a certain event in a book as, why is this there when that is one of the shaping events? And Zelazny is another one. Zelazny's fallen out of vogue, but amazing author. I don't want to go on all day. I could give you a list that kept going, but Katie Waitman's Marrow Tree is another one.
Johnny, do you not find it? These are actually really difficult questions to answer. If someone says, like, who should we look at that we don't look at anymore? And it's really hard to think of them because you go, but doesn't everyone still look at these authors? They're always in our heads, and like the fact that Zelazny isn't read as much anymore would never have occurred to me because it's Roger Zelazny. And
they've read the Amber stuff, but beyond that, the works that really dig deep, which Amber is not. Amber is the most easily accessible, but that's not what I consider to be the greatest of his works.
Yeah, and it was the same with Patricia McKillop, and it was only because a conversation with you, I think, that it made me think of that Patricia McKillop isn't given the respect.
She's
that
completely overlooked. Completely overlooked.
And yet, you said, oh, people don't read Patricia McKillop. I'm like, really? But it's Patricia McKillop.
Janny Killian is another one. The Janny Killian's series by Christine Smith. Almost nobody's even heard of that. It's a 5-book science fiction series. Very powerful work. The other one that a lot of people do read and do scream to the rafters about, but is kind of in the dim corners, is Matthew Woodring Stover's Kane series. It's violent and it's rough, and you can read it for sheer entertainment, but there's very, very profound stuff that it has to say about the manipulation of the entertainment industry and people by corporate. And there's a lot more to that than just the blood and guts of a character that says, fuck with me and I'll kill you. So there's a lot of works that are what I would call niche, that are overlooked by the mainstream, overlooked by the literary side of SF and fantasy, but have all of the substance you could ask for.
Yeah, I was going to be cheeky and answer the Beowulf poet, but I was going to say Janny Wurts too, but AP beat me to it, of course. So I'm going to focus a little bit more on the authors that should be studied by writers side of the question too. I think this writer gets a fair amount of recognition, but probably not as much from the, I feel like this author should probably be more recognized. Not necessarily ever going to be as big as some of the big, popular writers, but I mean recognition in terms of the literary value. And that Stephen Erickson, for me, is an author who's, for me, the part of the question about writers learning from other writers, I feel like I learned more from reading Stephen Erickson. And I've said it many times in videos, but reading the Malazan Book of the Fallen really liberated my imagination. It really delivered to me a whole new understanding of what fantasy could do. And a lot of that is because he's writing great literature is what he's doing. And it happens to be fantasy. So he's a writer I think that I would definitely put forward as someone that people could look to learn a lot from.
I left him off the list because I knew one of you guys was going to put him in there.
I'm surprised
but yes,
he
absolutely.
didn't say it first. He didn't steal that one from me, at least. So I got to answer something. But yeah, no, he's one. And I don't know that, he's never going to be the most popular fantasy writer ever. And
he's pretty popular.
he's done well. He's done well. He's done very well for himself. But
he's a scrapper. He's up and coming. He's doing his best.
He's doing he's keeping at it. But yeah, no, he would be the one that leapt to mind for me. So not in the sense that he's not talked about. And thank goodness. I mean, it hasn't been that long. I feel like it's only been the last 4 years or so that Malazan has gotten attention.
Oh, go to our fantasy. You will see that.
Oh, Reddit's different. I'm talking about YouTube. I was going to say YouTube.
Oh, okay.
Is a place where you would not have seen much Malazan content before 4 or 5 years ago. And that's changed a lot in the last 4 or 5 years. But yeah, he's my answer for that one.
Isn't it nice to see, though, that it's never too late in some cases that a writer can have a resurgence? Janny, again, is one that, was writing with all of the Hobbes and the Martins and the et cetera, and experiencing a resurgence of her work, and specifically on, Phil was talking about our space, BookTube, yep. YouTube, that's wonderful that she started to get some of that recognition that she deserves because...
Agreed.
Yeah, Janny, as everyone said, you are definitely underrated, and I now I'm not nearly as well read as the rest of you here, but I know now that I could pick up a book with your name covered on the title, and I would instantly recognize your writing after reading a few pages, and it's just the way every paragraph. There's nuance, every nuance of meaning. It's not easy. It's challenging.
It's not for the grasshopper readers.
Yeah, but what you do with your vocabulary, it's so expansive, and what you do with adjectives, it's remarkable. So, sorry, I didn't mean to hijack that. But I had to get that in there.
I think when you're sitting here writing in a field which has so much popular following now, and internet crowdsourced opinion is so much in your face. If you're a writer setting out to do something extremely individual and you're not just skimming across the surface, you're doing something much, much more intricate and deep, catching the reader that's able to sink into that and get it in time before they've grasshoppered over it and formed an opinion can be tough. And so that's something to think about. The more original the work, or the more it handles something that everybody would go, oh, that's just a trope. I already know everything that's about this, and draws that hard and fast conclusion too soon. It's about surrendering to the book. And to a varying degree, the ones you can't surrender to are the ones you're going to skip across the top of. So I'm not surprised that some works take longer to catch, and are lucky if they catch at all. And especially now with the algorithm working against that kind of a read. But how do you change the narrative surrounding a book so that it does connect with the right audience, so that your grasshopper readers go grasshop somewhere else to a book that can handle that style? And I like an escapist read. I like a read I don't have to pay attention to as much as anybody. There's some days I just want this stress off my back. So I'm not looking down on any of those books. But how do you mark or earmark the book that is not that, and capture the reader in the right mood where they're willing to be patient enough to sink into it? I think Mark Lawrence is very adept at grabbing that level of attention very quickly. But what if it's a book that's a whole lot more intricate than that? So I think that's a challenge that we face as a community. How do we read these books and direct them to the right audience and bring out the best of what those books have to author and have to offer in the field without skimming the surface and pushing past them and going on to the next hot thing? And I think YouTube is, as a community, is very good at helping at that. I'm sorry.
My response to that would be is every single one of us is on a journey to become a better reader. Like, none of us has perfected and are now in a state of grace when it comes to literacy and reading. Some of us, for example, Janny Wurts, are much further along in this journey and are much better at it. But it's something that we all work on. We still encounter new things. We encounter new ways of doing things, new words. What I think that helps with a lot of this is giving people the confidence to leave behind the familiar, to trying new things, and instead of reacting negatively because it's not what they're used to having that curiosity about the potentiality of what is in front of them, and to engage with that instead of, no, but that's not how this works. To that joy and that curiosity and that willingness to encounter new ways of doing things instead of how you understand it must be done. Because quite often, how you understand it must be done is wrong. It doesn't have to be done that way. And if the history of literature has taught us anything, it's that authors and writers and artists of all types will find ways to challenge the very rules that are set down. And then they find new ways to express themselves. And then they bring in old rules and blend them with new rules. And you end up, it's an art. And we need to be curious about that art again, instead of treating it as narrative content to be consumed, to just know what happened, give me the bullet points. If we treat it as digestible, consumable, disposable narrative content, we are doing disservice to the art that is narrative. We're doing disservice to the authors that write it, and we are doing disservice to ourselves as readers, because we are denying ourselves the beauty that can be found, the intensity, the passion, the emotion that can be found in literature, because we want that safe, comfortable read where the hero goes on a quest and kills a bunch of people. Literature, even with that story, even with that simple narrative thing that I just threw aside, that can become incredible in the right hands. And people looking at it and going, oh, well, it's just another farm boy going on a quest.
Yeah, but see, that's the thing. It's assumptions. It's assumptions. We're always fighting assumptions because we're living in a soundbite society where we're supposed to grasp it in a second. and know it all in a second. So it's how do we get people to look past that assumption of what they expect to see on the page as opposed to what really is on the page. Not to have interrupted you.
That was a perfect encapsulation of what I was long-windedly trying to say.
Well, I think a lot of this just kind of speaks to how we're all interconnected as a community, right? How do those books find their audience or viewers, right? And I think that it shows it's a very symbiotic relationship when it's done with respect and curiosity and interest, you know, rather than for views, which is a difficult thing to battle with, you know, for sure in this society. But I think all of us, it's pretty obvious. We've been talking for almost 2 hours now. We love long form content. We love sitting down and talking in depth about things. And just from my perspective, I think that this type of content specifically is what has helped me find the books that match me, or what has helped books find their right readership. Because it is hard in a bite-size, you know, time frame to say everything about a book that needs to be said. So I think that's why maybe all of us, I don't want to speak for everyone, but why a lot of us have found a home on YouTube rather than possibly some other platforms. Because I've tried the short form content. I just can't do it because I can't get out what I want to say in that time. It's not like the fault of the platform. It's just not how I review and talk about books. And I know, Philip, we've talked about this before, that you feel the same way about that. I think when we're doing our, you know, Greenbone Saga discussions, those are those are ridiculously long in one book each. So
I think the advantage of
I was just going to say real quickly, I'm afraid I do not have a future as a TikToker. But, yeah.
I think the advantage of the YouTube community and the channel is the human side of it, because you can read a print review, but it doesn't convey the enthusiasm. It doesn't convey the love and the joy of it, or the disappointment of it. It doesn't have that, we just sat down in your living room and talked about books. So we see the human side of your journey through that book and your interaction with the book, and it's much more personal.
Unless you're John Mauro, because his do.
I have to write and rewrite them like 5 or 6 times before I can get them to that point.
Well, that's how you know that there's love put into it, right? You know, a good review isn't just, it takes time. It really does. And PL, I also want to put out there, your written reviews are fantastic too. So don't be skipping over that.
They are.
But I want to, you know, we could talk forever. We really, really could. And I have so many questions, but maybe we'll have to do part 2 at some point. Get big brain energy part 2 going here. But since we are closing in on 2 hours, I wanted to give everyone a chance to kind of close out and let everyone know, if they're living under a rock, don't know who you guys are, as we've talked about being pillars of the space. But if they live under said rock, where can they find you? Any work that you want to talk about coming up, anything people should look out for, basically anything you want the audience to know who is watching this back afterwards. If we could all do a sign out, maybe the same way we did the introduction, start with Janny and then go to John, AP, and Philip. If that's good with you guys, maybe we'll start with Janny.
You can find me. I've got an extensive website, an extensive list of excerpts of all of my books. I paint. I do all kinds of other things, but I'm not hard to find on the internet. I'm on Twitter. I'm on Goodreads. I pop in and out of Art Fantasy here and then. I go drop through the page chewing forum, the written one, on the internet, and I'm really easily approached. So the website will tell you everything you need to know about me and my work and what's coming up.
Great. Likewise, just Google my name and everything will come up. You'll find my academic profile at Penn State, as well as Goodreads and LinkedIn. And feel free to send me a friend request. And I'm also trying to be as approachable as possible too. So thanks, everyone.
I'm still professionally grumpy, but you can find me on the YouTube channel A Critical Dragon. I am occasionally on Twitter or X. And I try to be on, but then I have huge periods of time when I am not engaged in social media at all. It's just the way my life is. But the best way to try and find me is via the YouTube channel.
And yeah, you can find me under that rock.
This rock?
Yeah, that one.
This little tiny rock.
Specifically.
It's got a little hole in it for you. See the little dent?
Oh, that's nice. That lets me have some air once in a while. Yeah. No, I'm not always under a rock. You'll find me on YouTube, Philip Chase, and I do fiddle around occasionally on Twitter. But those are the main places. Yeah. Or X. Yeah. Yep.
And what about my esteemed co-host PL? Where can people find you?
Oh, beside you, really, on wherever we are on page 2 in your channel, my channel. The books, www.plstore.com, and X, mostly other platforms. And before I go blog, so that's it.
And read his books. They're really good. The Drowned Kingdom tackles some profound subjects. Definitely check out Paul's books. I think we've already talked about Philip's.
And
yeah,
it goes without saying, Janny's obviously, I mean, Wars of Light and Shadow is going to go down as one of the greatest achievements ever in not just the fantasy genre, but in literature. So read them.
I second that. Read Philip's books too, because he's the new indie version of John Gwynne, J.R. Tolkien, and a few other authors that I think you would enjoy. So
I love the supportive nature of this group. It's so cute. I love it.
Don't read Philip's books. He's a nemesis and an evil person.
and my developmental editor is my nemesis. So read my books.
Well, that means that they've been highly critiqued, so we have good stuff coming out to us.
Oh, you wouldn't believe
we
it.
also have.
Well,
I would. I think I would.
Big name, right? Too. Yeah, we have to do this again soon, guys.
Sorry, wait. Daniel's comment.
Oh.
Dr. Mauro's books are known to make readers tears of joy.
Tears of joy all over this.
I mean, Glass is beautiful, John. There's no doubt about it.
Thank you.
Hey,
I've
Jenny,
met your students. They were all crying.
Jenny, didn't you write a short story?
All joy.
Jenny, didn't you write a short story about Glass at one point?
I did a long time ago. I wish I'd known John then, because he probably could have critiqued whether I got it right or not. It involved a guy making homemade first surface mirrors, and Möbius looping time at the same time as the mirror was being made. So yeah, it's in the anthology Elemental that was done for the tsunami relief. It's called Möbius Trip. So yeah, if you want to check out, and then you can come and slam it with a review saying she didn't know what the hell she was talking about, because I was coming from an astronomer's viewpoint of knowing what a first surface mirror and so forth. So
all right, I will.
So yeah, I did circle. It was a science fiction kind of.
Janny, you are like, I call Miles Cameron the most interesting man in the world. You're like the most interesting woman in the world. What have you not done? Horses, sailing, what have you not done?
Well, I've done a couple things that I bounced right off of real quick, and that's modern dance and golf. Forget it. I hated it. Hated it.
Club, man. You guys in debt like
what? You get in it's like hit the ball, jump in a little car, chase it. Hit the ball, jump in a little car, and chase it. I'd rather ride a horse across that territory than do that.
We're going to the club. I'm taking you out. We're night out to all you guys.
PL, I hope you noticed there when you asked Janny what is it you haven't done, she didn't say killed a man.
Nope, haven't done that.
Well, we did talk about body farms, so
yes.
Oh man. All right, so if you have somehow found this video on my channel and you don't know who I am, first, thank you for being here and for joining Page Twoing. You can find me on my channel, Maybe Between the Pages, beside PL Stuart and wonderful guests like the 4 that we have here. You could also find me on Before We Go blog alongside John and PL as well. I am on Goodreads. I do reviews there. You can find me on Twitter. All of my social, links are in the description down below. So the channel is a good place to go for like a hub for that kind of stuff. Thank you, everyone, for joining us in the comment section. These comments were delightful. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this interview, it is what makes what we do what it is. So thoroughly appreciate it. And anyone watching afterwards as well. Thank you so much to our guests. I feel so blessed to be able to talk to you guys the amount that I have been able to. And looks like the crowd wants a part 2. So we'll just have to accept that might have to happen one day.
Thank you for having us. And John, it was a pleasure to meet you.
Pleasure to meet you too. Thanks for inviting me.
Of course. Well, for now, though, until part 2, we're going to head out and talk to you guys later. Bye.
Bye.